Okay, I'm reading from the Revolution newspaper, October the 25th, 2009. This is on the 150th anniversary of the anti-slavery attack on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, the heroic legacy of John Brown. Okay, October the 16th marks the 150th anniversary of John Brown's daring and heroic raid on the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Brown led a force of 21 men. They aimed to seize arms and distribute them to the slaves and then go to the mountains to wage guerrilla war against slavery in the southern U.S. Brown's force quickly seized the arsenal but were unable to break out. Well, of course not. That was never going to work. You don't overcome evil with evil. It doesn't work that way. Harriet Tubman showed the way. However, they then defended the arsenal for over 2 days against a force of 800 militia and were only finally defeated and captured by a detachment of U.S. Marines. Duh! You can't go seize their guns and ammunition and think that the whole military isn't coming for you. Of course they are. You have to feed the people, clean the streets, clean out the streams, teach people how not to be violent, help the people stop taking drugs in order to feel better. Only then will you defeat the police. You can't kill them. That's wrong. Do not return evil for evil. I understand that the slaves were enslaved, and I'm as angry as anybody is. The Harper's Ferry raid didn't come out of nowhere. Listen to this. By the time of the raid, U.S. society had long been simmering. The capitalists. Who are the capitalists? The World Fair people. The Olmsted architectural firm. The capitalists based in the northern United States, Seattle, were increasingly coming into conflict with the southern slaveholders on a range of economic and political issues. Economic and political. Notice they say nothing about humanity. And the slaveholding class felt that their system was under attack. Serious political crisis would periodically erupt, followed by compromise, followed by still more crisis. It had nothing to do with the slaves, because Northerners had slaves. The South was becoming powerful. And they were also separating themselves from the North. Slave revolts and the systematic widespread escape of slaves through the Underground Railroad went on. That would be Harriet Tubman and a few Quakers who helped her along the way. But mostly it was Harriet Tubman. As did severe repression against the slaves and the abolitionists, those who favored the abolition of slavery. Again, we're going to talk about the Quakers because isn't that who was doing it? I'm pretty sure Christians were owning slaves. I'm pretty sure Christians were going to church and using the Bible as a reason to own slaves. By 1859, the situation had become extremely intense, but there was still no major political figure of any established party, including Abraham Lincoln, who called for abolition of slavery in the South. It was in this situation that Brown put his plan in motion. John Brown was driven by a bitter hatred of slavery. If anybody's bitter about slavery, it's God. But he was also inspired by a firm belief in the humanity and the absolute equality of the enslaved black masses and in their capacity to free themselves once they saw an opening and a way to do so. In both of these convictions and in his unquenchable desire to end slavery as soon as possible, John Brown was far in advance of the vast majority of white abolitionists of his time. Brown fought slavery for many years, only to see the laws become ever more restrictive and the conditions of the slaves grow ever worse. He came to believe, correctly as it turns out, this is what they thought, correctly as it turns out, and whoever wrote this newspaper article believes it was correct, that slavery would only be destroyed through armed struggle. There is another way. We will free ourselves without armed struggle. Unless, of course, we're arming ourselves with rakes and shovels to dig wells and to clean out the streams and to plant plants and to stop building up the matrix. But it isn't going to be through guns. John Brown's raid was initially condemned in both the North and the South, and he was quickly tried and sentenced to death. But Brown used his trial to put forward his anti-slavery views in a compelling way, and that, along with courage, made a strong impression. By the time of his execution, not even 7 weeks after the raid, things had already begun to change. In the North, the previously wavering and mostly conciliatory abolitionist movement. Wavering and conciliatory. That means that they weren't really doing anything. They may have disliked it, but they weren't really getting involved to end it. As well as broader masses and white people who, for one reason or another, opposed slavery, finally began to galvanize. They finally began to come together. This was especially so after Henry David Thoreau, a major poet and intellectual of the time, dared to step out in the midst of the anti-John Brown hysteria. Anti-John Brown hysteria. And declared that Brown's raid had been a blow for justice. In the South, the slaveholders went into a frenzy of lynching and murder. But despite the severe repression, slave revolts spread through the South, particularly in the months after the government executed Brown and his comrades. In one revolt in Texas, in July 1860, slaves were alleged to have set a series of fires in a number of Texas towns. 10 whites and at least 65 blacks were killed in the revolt and its aftermath. When white Texans went on a rampage of torture and lynching to extract confessions. Sound like waterboarding to you? Sounds like what the government's still doing today? Many of the accused slaves refused to confess or implicate others and went to their deaths silent in the face of hideous tortures. Hideous tortures. Can you imagine a hideous torture? Just 18 months after John Brown's raid, the first shots of the Civil War were fired, and the Union soldiers marched off to war. They sang that John Brown's body lies a moldering in his grave, but his soul is marching on. But even with the Civil War underway, the Northern capitalists, as represented by Lincoln, still refused to free the slaves. Lincoln did not start the war to free the slaves. He wanted the whole United States. He wanted to govern the whole United States. It had nothing to do with the slaves. He didn't care. He owned slaves himself. It wasn't until 1863 that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which finally, after 250 years of horror, freed the slaves. A few months later, Lincoln, again under pressure from below, and forced by the need to more decisively confront and attack the South, allowed black people to join the Army. Join the Union Army, not until then. The former slaves, as well as those who had won their freedom before the war, enlisted in massive numbers and played a major role in defeating the slave-holding class. Anyone truly opposed to injustice should celebrate John Brown's life and courageous example. I disagree with that, but he was instrumental in changing things. For more on the importance of slavery and the formation of the U.S. and the great struggle to abolish it, as well as the centuries-long battle against the oppression of black people, see The Oppression of Black People, The Crimes of the System, and the Revolution We Need, a special issue of Revolution number 144.